Today I'm going to explain how to set a 1/4 of an inch on your machine. So as a raw beginner, you know which foot to use and how to move your needle if that's the choice you make. So sit back and watch. In the patchwork and quilting world, we usually use a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance for sewing our pieces together, or 0.75 centimeters if you're working in metric. Your regular machine foot, which could resemble one of these, has a flat bottom and a wide slot in there. These feet can be used for a 1/4 of an inch, and I will show you how in a moment. But you might have purchased a 1/4 of an inch foot, and here are 3 different ones from various different makes of machines. The idea being is that your needle will go in the center hole there, and this flange that runs down the side will actually run along the edge of the fabric. Now, these are good feet. The problem is that over time, the distance between the flange and that little hole in the middle there can spread. You also have to make certain that your needle goes in the center, so check that you can drop the needle down. So you could use one of these feet. Another watch point to be careful of with these particular makes of feet is there is a second hole. Don't get your needle in that hole because that is not a 1/4 of an inch. So these are possible choices for a 1/4 of an inch foot. The problem is this flange. Over time it spreads, and when you're sewing over a lumpy bumpy bit, perhaps you've got your seams all in one direction and it's very lumpy, this thing can slew slightly. Its other problem is that it's quite narrow and doesn't always fit on the feed dogs, and you'll see this more clearly in a moment. So that is one variety of 1/4 inch feet. A better variety of 1/4 inch feet, in my opinion, are these ones. Now here again, your needle goes in the center hole there, and it's this edge that will be your 1/4 of an inch. The one for the Bernina looks a bit like this, needle in the center, and you use that edge of the presser foot. The problem is with many of these feet is that when you inadvertently have a blonde moment and you move the needle off center or away from the hole, or if over time you've inadvertently banged the needle bar and it's shifted, if your needle isn't in the middle, then you won't get a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and things can go horribly wrong. You either break the needle or your seam allowance gets a little bit screwed up. So these feet are other options. My favorite one, I suppose, is this one. It's a generic one. It's not expensive to buy. If you have one of these feet, people are a bit apt to say, oh, this is a wonderful foot. This is a foot that I can see through. I will use this and set my needle at the 1/4 of an inch position I'm going to show you in a moment. Do not use these feet because these feet do not have a flat bottom. If I turn it over, can you see it has a ridged bit? You can see it more clearly on this particular foot, which is designed for Bernina. These feet slide as you go over seams because they don't sit nice and flat on the material as does the regular presser foot, or indeed any of the 1/4 of an inch feet. So as a watch point, please don't use these feet for your seaming. They're not for seaming, they're for applique use, satin stitch use and other uses. So put those to one side. Coming back to using the regular foot, these ones. Now the advantage of using the regular foot is that we can actually set our needle position to be a 1/4 of an inch from this edge of the presser foot. Why would you want to use these feet and not the others? The answer is simple. There's a nice wide slot there. You don't have the problem of moving the needle, as you would on that, and breaking it. You can move the needle. So if you have a blonde moment, it doesn't matter. It also fits on the feed dogs, because many of the presser feet that are 1/4 of an inch are not quite so wide. If you compare the distance between these 2 feet, this is a Bernina straight stitch foot and a 1/4 of an inch. This one doesn't sit on the feed dogs as well as that one does. So I personally prefer to use one of these feet and shift the needle. When it comes to moving the needle, the answer is simple. You use the stitch width button on your machine and you press that until you set the needle at a certain point. On this machine, we have the LED display here, and you have your stitch length and your stitch width. And for those of you who perhaps can't remember which is which, this has a little wiggle on it, W for width. It's this measurement we need to increase. 3.5 is the needle in the middle of the foot, but if I increase it to 5.5, that will put the needle at a 1/4 of an inch from this edge of the regular foot. So the regular foot fits the feed dogs nicely, has a nice wide slot for when I have that blonde moment and I can shift the needle. Not all machines, the measurement is 5.5. If you've got one of the bigger machines, the big Jennies, you'll find your measurement is 8.3. It's well worth checking the machine and getting yourself an accurate little ruler and just check that the distance between the needle and the edge of the presser foot is 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Then you know you're right. The nice thing about being able to adjust your needle is you can set it for your own personal seam allowance. So many machines are 5.5. If you're looking at something like a Bernina, you'll be adjusting the needle, and very often it's the sort of the third pip in from the right hand side. The big Husqvarnas and Pfaffs, you may well find the setting is completely different, and it's well worth checking. Could be round about 8.3, a bit like the Jennies. The very small little Elna Lotus, not so much the Elna Lotus, but the little Jennie, that little tiny one you often see in classes, the measurement there won't be 5.5 because the stitch width doesn't go to that. It'll be 3.5. So try moving your needle, do it with the stitch width button. It will give you an accurate seam allowance, and then you've got a nice flat foot. It fits the feed dogs. Needle can come over and you will get an accurate seam allowance. But if you don't like that, you can always buy one of those proprietary feet.